As everyone gathered, all eyes turned to Lightning. She had finally woken up, looking a little dazed but otherwise fine. After a thorough checkup, Agatha confirmed that she was physically fine but suffered extreme fatigue from the prolonged flight. Even Nightfall's abilities backed up the same conclusion. But what about the wound? Agatha explained that the problem wasn't the injury but something more complicated. Somehow, Lightning's magic had been tainted or perhaps corrupted, even without any direct contact. Nightingale found that hard to believe. If Lightning had been affected by demonic energy, she would have noticed immediately. Agatha, however, pointed out that the corruption was subtle, almost microscopic, compared to Lightning's own magic. It's too small to detect at a glance. It was the balance magic stone that had sensed something was off. Whether it was true corruption or something else was still uncertain. Roland took a moment to process this. Demons had never shown this kind of ability before. Agatha explained that while magic affecting others existed, however, preventing a wound from healing was unheard of. But if that's the case, then things would make sense. Normally, the power of the God Punishment Stone would cleanse such corruption, but clearly, this wasn't a simple case. Roland wanted a solution. Unfortunately, there is none, at least for now. The best course of action was to take Lightning to the third border town for observation. Perhaps Pasha might have more insight. With a sigh, Roland nodded. Walking over to Lightning, he saw her lower her head, looking quite guilty. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaky. She almost broke into tears as she apologized. Roland simply reached out, resting a hand on her head. He offered her reassurance and then tells her that she would be fine, he would make sure of it. Lightning looked at Roland for a moment before giving a small smile and nodding. After arriving at the third border town, Roland wasted no time checking on her condition. Pasha reassured him, saying Lightning had recovered significantly. With Eleanor by her side these past few days, she had been distracted enough to momentarily forget about her encounter with the high-ranking demon. But there was still the bigger question: what exactly had affected her? Wendy asked if they had found anything, but the answer was disappointing. No records in their archives matched this phenomenon, but Pasha had a theory. If it wasn't documented, then perhaps it was something entirely new, maybe an ability that demons had only recently developed. That said, similar effects did exist, and the consequences were concerning. Pasha's expression darkened, and she believed this might actually be a curse. Leading the group deeper into a cave stacked with books and old scrolls, she pulled one out, dusting it off before handing it to Roland. He scanned the pages, descriptions of wounds that refused to heal, victims weakened by gradual blood loss, and traces of foreign magic lingering in their bodies. If this case followed the same pattern, conventional treatments wouldn't work, and removing it through external means would be nearly impossible. But Nightingale believed there gotta be a way to remove the curse. Pasha turned the page and continued explaining. The records told the story of a witch named Samanja, who had faced a similar predicament. In a desperate final stand, she became a transcendent witch and split the high-ranking demon in half. While her allies had succumbed to the curse, she, against all odds, somehow survived. Seems like if Lightning had truly been afflicted by such a curse, there was only one solution, which was to kill the demon responsible. Pasha acknowledged the difficulty of such a task. Nightingale, silent until now, clenched her fists. Roland took a deep breath, then snapped the book shut. It wouldn't be easy, but there was no way he was giving up. Then another thought crossed his mind. If this demon could inflict such a curse without direct contact, what would happen to ordinary people who got caught by it? Pasha believed it would only be much worse. Since mortals are much more fragile, not only will their wounds not heal, but they will likely get worse over time. The inevitable result would just be death. Roland then asked if the God Punishment Stone countered this ability. Pasha hesitated before answering, saying it could, however, only to an extent. But if they are talking about a magic slayer, the stone's effect might be far less reliable. Meanwhile, in the other room, Lightning slowly opened her eyes. She curled up in a corner, hugging her knees tightly. She was scared and uncertain about her future. In a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke to the silence. "Father, what should I do?" As the scene shifts, a royal guard approaches and reports that everything is ready. But instead of stepping forward himself, Roland gestured toward Anna. Today, he announced, the person in charge would be the Minister of Engineering. The guard hesitated for a moment, then addressed Anna formally as Her Majesty, the Queen. Anna stepped forward, her voice steady as she gave the order to begin the test. On the track stood not only a train but also the new artillery piece. The sound of gears grinding against each other filled the air as the mechanism activated. Watching all this, Axe gulped. To him, this very weapon looked so much like the demon they saw the other day. Just then everyone heard a loud explosion. The cannon roared, sending a shell hurtling through the air. The shockwave rippled across the gathered crowd, leaving them momentarily stunned. Roland and Anna, however, looked pleased, seeing the test going very well. Edith, on the other hand, was practically beaming. With this, she pointed out, the biggest missing piece of their plan to attack Takira ruins was now complete. The only thing left was the name. Roland then smiled, calling it Black River. Edith caught on to the name, saying it mirrored the red mist that fueled their enemies. Roland confirmed it with a nod. The red mist was the demon's lifeline, but now, they would have a lifeline of their own. The scene then shifts to Neverwinter. A voice called out, telling Buggy and Good it was time to head out. Buggy quickly wiped his mouth, set down his plate, and hurried to get ready. Good meanwhile pulled on his coat, and the girl in the room asked him if he really didn't need her to come along. Good tells her that she's too young and they have already had this conversation countless times. She pouted, but Good cut her off. He knew she was about to bring up her time in Wolfheart again. And no, he wasn't about to let her keep doing what she had done before. Before leaving, he warned her not to wander off. Then, with a grin, he promised to bring back some crispy egg pancakes for her. With that, he rushed downstairs, joining Buggy and another boy. The three set off together, discussing what job they'd be looking to today, maybe clearing snow, breaking ice, or really anything to keep busy. The boy turned to Buggy, asking what he was planning to do. Buggy said he wasn't here to work, just tagging along. But that wasn't entirely true. He had actually caught the attention of the foreman from Engineering Team 6. In just a few days, he'd be signing a contract. Formal recruitment meant double pay, meaning it was more than enough to start saving for a down payment. After he got his ID, he'd officially become a resident of Neverwinter. Excitement was building as they made their way into the city center. That's when they noticed a large crowd gathered around a tent. It looked like some sort of recruitment. A man with a loudspeaker was calling out to the crowd, explaining that they were looking for able-bodied men. Since literacy and ID were not required, all they need is to pass the physical test to get in. The crowd fell silent for a moment. This was unexpected because army requirements had always been limited to official residents. So why had that rule suddenly changed? Good's heart skipped a beat. Joining the First Army meant a lifetime of security, food, clothing, shelter, everything taken care of. Even in death, his family would be greatly compensated. To him, this was a guaranteed future. But Buggy had already made a promise to the foreman. Good nodded in understanding, then pushed his way into the crowd. The younger boy hesitated, unsure of what to do. Buggy gave him a firm pat on the shoulder, telling him this wasn't his time anymore, this was for the younger generation. He told the boy to go. The boy clenched his fists, made up his mind, and followed. After registering, they got in line. Neither had any idea what the test would be. But Good was confident, and if it was a physical test, he had nothing to worry about. Then they heard the scream. A sharp, gut-wrenching wail from inside the tent sent a shiver down their spines. The boy froze, wondering if they were testing pain tolerance. Good quickly shook his head. If it were torture, the screams would have been more spaced out. Then they heard people throwing up. The two looked at each other, neither of them wanted to go inside anymore. When the first batch of recruits stumbled out, hardly any of them could stand properly. Good then did a quick count. It seemed like 9 out of 10 had failed, but what stood out the most was how weak they looked. Their legs shook, and their balance was gone, yet these were strong and healthy men just minutes ago. Soon their names were called. A military officer stood before them, barely sparing a glance as he introduced himself, not by name, but simply as the examiner. No point in names, he explained, because most of them wouldn't make it past today, anyway. Even for those who passed, this was only the first step. By now, most of them had realized this wasn't recruitment for the First Army but probably the Second Army or possibly a new reserve force. But Good didn't care. As long as the pay could provide a better life for him and Rachel, he was willing to take the risk. The rules were announced, and they were quite simple. They had to place both feet on a pedal and sit still for 5 minutes. No matter what happened, no matter what they saw, they weren't allowed to fall off the chair. It sounded too easy. Then the curtains closed, the room went black, and soon they saw a flash. The next thing Good knew, he was floating. Or at least, that's what it felt like. His stomach dropped, and his limbs flailed for balance. Panic surged through his body before his mind caught up. He quickly realized he was still sitting, and this was an illusion. But damn if it didn't feel real. He gritted his teeth, repeating to himself, "Stay calm, stay seated." Then, Rachel's face flashed in his mind. That moment when she had looked at him with trust. He latched onto that thought like a lifeline, anchoring himself against the overwhelming sensation of weightlessness. He vowed to himself that he would never allow Rachel to return to her old life. Minutes later, the illusion disappeared. Applause broke through the silence. When the first test was over, those who remained were congratulated, but they were also warned that there was a long way to go. He exhaled shakily, only now realizing he was drenched in sweat. His hands trembled, thinking that was just the first test. He could barely believe he had made it through, because sitting here was already a blessing. Good glanced around, but his buddy was already gone. Did he fall off in fear, or had someone knocked him over? The remaining recruits were led into another room, where they were instructed to take their seats. The only requirement this time was to stay put. Then the button was pressed. The moment the machine activated, Good felt himself spinning. slowly at first, then faster and faster. Soon, the world blurred, the faces of the examiners vanishing into streaks of motion. His stomach churned and his head felt like it was being tossed in all directions. This made him wonder if they were trying to recruit monsters for the army. Just as he reached the verge of blacking out, the machine came to a stop. Once again, he heard people clapping. After a few more tests, it was finally over. Apparently, they had passed the initial selection. But there was still something the examiner wanted to tell them. Good fought back the overwhelming nausea, forcing himself to look up. The man's voice was calm, almost amused. Many recruits, he said, joined the military dreaming of a comfortable life, high pay, and security. But those weren't the things that actually kept people here. Over time, they would realize there was something far greater worth pursuing. When that moment came, their original motivations would seem insignificant. With a smirk, the examiner turned to leave. Good watched him go, realizing the officer was much nicer than he expected. Standing up on shaky legs, he called out, asking if they could at least know the man's name. The examiner turned around, striking a dramatic pose before grinning over his shoulder, telling them his name was Vanner. Then, laughing, he added, "You're welcome to seek revenge on me anytime." And just like that, he was gone. Good stood there, dumbfounded because that was not what he had meant at all. They were soon brought to the next room. Wade stood at the center, surveying the recruits with a look of interest. He muttered something about these being the knight candidates. That caught Good off guard, and he wondered if the First Army was actually recruiting knights. Usually, the title was reserved for noble-born warriors, the kind of role he'd never even dreamed of. Before he could dwell on it, Tilly strode into the room, smiling and said it's actually called Sky Knights. The name alone made it clear who had come up with it. Of course, it was her brother. But she was quick to add that they were far from that stage. For now, they were merely recruits. As she got closer to the men, the royal guard hesitated, unsure whether they should step aside, but Tilly waved them off, saying she had protection. As she greeted the recruits, Good felt his face heat up, but he wasn't alone. The entire group turned red before finally recognizing who stood before them, and they hurriedly knelt. Tilly motioned for them to rise. She knew they had questions. The unusual recruitment, the strange selection process, there was a lot to explain. But for now, she kept it simple. First, they weren't joining the First Army or the Second Army. This was something entirely new. Her brother had plans for a completely different kind of military force, unlike anything the world had seen before, and that's why the tests had been so unconventional. Excitement surged through the room until she delivered the next blow. She tells them they weren't even close to being called soldiers yet. At best, they were reserve candidates, starting from the absolute bottom. The trials ahead would be far more grueling than what they had just endured. Compared to what was coming, these tests were nothing but child's play. She then became more serious and said out of the 16 people standing there, maybe, just maybe 1 or 2 would make it as Sky Knights. Or possibly none for that matter. Good's heart pounded. So it really was knighthood. He didn't know what separated a Sky Knight from a traditional knight. But that didn't matter because for the first time, a commoner with no noble ties was being given the chance, and of course, it would be hard. But when had anything in his life ever been easy? Tilly continued, explaining that right now, only she and her brother fully understood what this new force would become. However, since her brother had other responsibilities, the training and leadership would fall to her instead. Good finally realized this wasn't just about joining a new army. If they succeeded, they might actually become knights personally appointed by the princess herself. That realization spread through the group like wildfire. Excitement bubbled up, and the atmosphere shifted. Tilly noticed the sudden change but was not entirely sure why, but she pressed on anyway. All successful recruits would be moving to a designated training site. There, they would receive new housing, official identification, and a place within the new royal capital. But there was a catch. Even as reserve members, they were now under military jurisdiction. Dropping out midway wouldn't be as simple as walking away, it would be considered desertion. Any act of defying military orders would also have consequences. The recruits straightened immediately, voicing their commitment. Satisfied, Tilly nodded and handed things over to Wade for the final step. Wade stepped forward, holding a piece of paper, and instructed them to repeat after him. And so, they swore their oaths to the King of Grey Castle. By evening, the sun had dipped below the horizon. The streets were quiet, most people were already gone. Without wasting another second, he sprinted home. Back home, Rachel was cooking dinner. Before he could say anything, she glanced over saying he was late. Good scratched his head, apologizing. But she already heard from the neighbor that Good had landed a great job. But she wasn't interested in the details. Instead, she held out her hand expectantly. Good looked confused. Rachel frowned, pointing at him saying he promised her egg pancakes. As it turned out, Good had completely forgotten about it. He scrambled to make up for it, swearing he'd bring some next time. Actually, every week, and as much as she wants. But Rachel looked unconvinced. Hoping to distract her, he quickly pulled something from his bag and asked her to look at it. It was a package from the princess. Inside were several books, but Good doesn't know how to read. Rachel took one, glancing at the cover, and read a few words such as Flight and Operations. The full name turned out to be Flight Principles and Operations Manual. Back in Roland's study, Tilly handed over the final roster to Roland. He took it with a nod, passing her a cup of tea and asking how the recruitment was going. Tilly replied not as many as they hoped, but the ones they got were fine. In the end, only 200 recruits made the cut. She wasn't satisfied with the numbers because against demons, that number was barely a drop in the ocean. Roland, however, believed the first step was always the hardest. Once they had real examples like true pioneers leading the way, the second wave of recruitment would go much smoother. And when that time came, it wouldn't just be limited to Neverwinter. Tilly and Nightingale exchanged glances, both wondering what he was planning. Roland closed his eyes, his thoughts drifting somewhere else. He knew people had different ambitions and different perspectives. But one thing had always been true: the fact humans always had an innate longing for the vast, open skies. And if they were to claim their place in the air, the first step was building an army that could fly. Of course, he didn't get ahead of himself. Training pilots wasn't like training foot soldiers. With flight control systems still in their infancy, natural talent was everything. Basic endurance, coordination, and resistance to vertigo were just entry-level requirements. Spatial awareness, quick reflexes, and an instinctive grasp of aircraft mechanics, those were what truly determined the best pilots. While the First Army's veterans were disciplined and reliable, they weren't necessarily suited for this new force. Handpicking a few outstanding officers was possible, but forming an entire air corps from existing soldiers was pushing it. That was why he had widened the selection criteria, bringing in fresh recruits from the new residents. Just then, something caught his attention. 6 recruits had failed to complete the oath ceremony. Nightingale leaned in and tells him those 6 hadn't simply been hesitant, they were actually lying. Wade had taken them aside for questioning, and 2 of them were even official residents of Neverwinter. Roland sighed. It wasn't exactly surprising. People change, and loyalty wavers. He had never expected everyone to be unwaveringly devoted. But even so, seeing this firsthand left a bitter taste. The investigation wasn't over yet, but Nightingale had pieced together the basics. These people had been bribed by foreign merchants, trying to infiltrate the military for firearms technology. The authorities had already moved in. So far, only one low-level assistant had been caught in a local hotel. But thanks to Summer's abilities, they managed to uncover a letter from the old royal capital. The mastermind behind it turned out to be a noble. They now had names and faces, and thanks to Soroya's sketches, those faces had already been sent to Tassa through messenger animals, so catching them is just a matter of time. Roland said nothing at first. Nightingale looked at him for a moment, then tilted her head asking if something was bothering him. He chuckled, shook his head, and said she had done well. But if these nobles wanted to play games, he had just the place for them. The mines at North Slope could always use extra hands. Seems like some people are still clinging to the past, refusing to accept that the world has changed. He wasn't surprised. After all, feudal rule had lasted for over 1,000 years. No one could expect it to disappear overnight. Tilly brought the conversation back on track. The issue with the people was solved, but what about the planes? Roland cleared his throat awkwardly, quickly shifting the topic to something else, mentioning that Evelyn had recently crafted a batch of chaos drinks with an incredible taste and asking if Tilly wanted to try some. Instinctively, Tilly agreed, but the moment the words left her mouth, she realized what had just happened. They were talking about planes. Was Roland seriously telling her he hadn't even built one yet? Roland explained that most people still needed to start with basic literacy and theoretical knowledge, and that gliders could serve as a demonstration. But before he could finish, Tilly slammed her hand on the table, firmly pointing out that even gliders, once modified, flew completely differently from an actual plane. If she hadn't personally operated a real plane, how could she possibly teach others? Roland cast a worried glance at his poor, abused table as Tilly continued, making it clear that even if things went as he suggested, she would still need at least a month to fully understand the aircraft's capabilities and adjust the flight manual accordingly. That also took time. Since Roland had entrusted this responsibility to her, she had no choice but to push him to complete his part of the job. Wiping the sweat from his forehead, Roland quickly promised that within 2 weeks, he would deliver a fully operational plane. Only then did Tilly seem satisfied. And, of course, since the matter was settled, it was finally time to try that amazing chaos drink. After the 3 of them enjoyed their drinks, Tilly said her goodbyes and left. Nightingale, however, seemed puzzled. When Roland asked what was wrong, she pointed out that Tilly often called him brother in public, but rarely did so when they were alone. Roland realized she had a point. He had no idea why either. Both of them rubbed their chins trying to figure out why. Meanwhile, on the other side, Akima's escort team was making their way through the mountain. It wasn't long before they came across a trap. Everyone immediately readied themselves for a potential battle, and upon triggering the mechanism, they discovered it was a tripwire linked to a barrage of spears. There were quite a few of these traps scattered around, but they didn't seem like the kind set by ordinary hunters. These traps looked meant for humans. Sean questioned where the trigger was, but the guide in the group shook his head. The vines under their feet, the branches above any part of the surroundings could be part of the mechanism. Burning the whole area down would be the only way to get rid of them. For a moment he even considered taking a detour. But before anyone could decide, the Takara witch stepped forward and pulled out her sword while signaling everyone to move back. The Baldy even tried to calm her down, warning her it was too dangerous. He could barely bring himself to watch. But in just a few seconds, every single trap was sliced in half. The entire terrain in front of them had changed. Deciding to be thorough, she went ahead and cut down all the surrounding vines as well. Satisfied with her work, she turned back to the group and casually informed them that the path was now clear. Akima's mouth hung open and she thought to herself that this Takara witch was exactly the kind of force one would expect from someone sent by His Majesty. The group pressed forward, though the Baldy was still in disbelief. He quickly praised everyone for their extraordinary skills. But the witch cut him off, uninterested in flattery. What she wanted was an explanation. Why were these kinds of traps in the mountains? They clearly weren't meant for hunting animals. He hesitated for a moment before admitting the truth. These traps were indeed designed for people. The further they climbed the mountain, the more they would find. In fact, this mountain, which is called Cage Mountain, actually had another name called Trap Mountain. These weren't recent additions either. Generations of lords had left them behind, all with one purpose: to keep out the Wolfheart Kingdom. That revelation caught the group off guard. Turned out, the mountain range stretched all the way from the coast to the ruins of Old Holy City, forming a natural border between the two kingdoms. On the other side lay the Kingdom of Dawn. But the real issue was the mountain's shape. From the south, it appeared to be a steep rise, but in reality, the slope was gentle enough that descending was much easier than it seemed. This made it a perfect route for neighboring raiders, hunters, and refugees, all of whom frequently crossed into Dawn's territory, leaving the local citizens in constant distress. For the local lords, it was an ongoing headache. But instead of strengthening defenses, they came up with what they saw as a more permanent solution, which was simply abandoning the area altogether. That surprised the group even more. Instead of defending their own land, the rulers had just given up on it. He shrugged, explaining that the nobility had no desire to attract the king's attention to the issue. After all, they weren't the desperate ones struggling to survive on the other side of the mountain. Unlike the Wolfheart refugees, they had the luxury of simply living elsewhere. So, after sealing off the region, they filled it with dense vines, wild vegetation, and an endless number of traps. Over the centuries, this practice had transformed the mountain into what it is today. As the group moved forward, Akima found herself thinking about the irony of it all. The same people who built the traps to keep outsiders away ended up trapped themselves. They had isolated their enemies, but in doing so, they had also cut themselves off. She knew, however, that His Majesty Roland would never choose such a path. She believes that Roland's eyes are always set on the horizon, always beyond what is in front of him. She can't believe she's actually thinking about him. But anyway, the mission came first. The sooner she completed it, the sooner she could return to her sisters. Activating her ability, she quickly traced what they were searching for. Excitement rippled through the group, but before they could charge ahead, the Takara witch signaled them to stop. She then tells everyone she will scout ahead alone. Beyond the trees stood an abandoned structure. This didn't make sense to Akima. His Majesty had sent her to locate a rare mineral, so why was the source coming from a ruin? However, the Takara witch found this place very interesting. When Sean asked what she meant, she explained that remnants of an underground civilization could be found scattered across the continent. But what made it even more intriguing was the script found in these ruins. However, these symbols didn't seem to be their language, nor did they resemble the characters standardized by the Federation. Considering the histories of the four great kingdoms, wasn't that interesting enough? Akima didn't quite understand what she was trying to say, but Sean on the other hand began brainstorming. He had once heard His Majesty mention that the four great kingdoms were originally nothing more than scattered villages and small towns, little more than the forgotten edges of the continent. In other words, they had no real history. But if this ruin wasn't a remnant of the Divine War, then it meant that at some point in the past, perhaps an unknown civilization had lived here. The Takara witch wasn't ready to jump to conclusions just yet. There was only one way to find out, meaning they had to go inside. Before they could move forward, someone else called attention to a stone tablet nearby. Unlike the unfamiliar symbols in the ruins, this one seemed to be written in their own language. Sean stepped closer, reading the words aloud. Land of the Divine Curse. Enter and face certain death. Beside it, they saw a pile of skeletal remains. The bald man recoiled backward, his voice shaking as he muttered, "Could this be the cursed temple?" All eyes turned to him and it seemed like he knew something. He admitted that he had only ever heard rumors and old tales passed down for generations. The story dates back nearly a century. Back then, a local lord had ordered a massive effort to block the Wolfheart invaders from bypassing the mountain. Traps had been laid across the region, and somewhere along the way, a knight-led expedition stumbled upon this place while carrying out their mission. All of a sudden the Takira witch cut him off before he could continue. She then said they probably found some treasure, smuggled it out, and then got cursed by the gods, one by one dying miserable deaths. The bald man nodded hesitantly. She then scoffed, saying mortals really haven't changed much, have they? The same nonsense from centuries ago still works on them. If she had to guess, the whole story was likely a fabrication, something the lords had cooked up so they could hoard whatever wealth was hidden inside. As for the so-called cursed victims, more than likely, they were murdered to keep the secret buried. The bald man quickly shook his head, explaining that they didn't die right away. It took nearly a decade and they slowly died one by one. However, their final moments were said to be agonizing. It was said their skin peeling from their faces, features twisted in pain. That was how the legend of the curse began. Can you guess what happened and what exactly was this so-called curse was?